Welcome, everybody. For those of you who attended Adam Shelton's presentation yesterday, you'll already know about Rebecca Officer. But for the rest of you, and I don't know how many of you didn't see the presentation yesterday about careers in technical communication, Rebecca manages the product documentation group at Allied Telesis Labs in Christchurch. And in her spare time, she writes for her church and indulges her love of the visual by spending far too much on camera gear. We look forward to hearing about Agile and Scrum methodology. Thanks, Rebecca.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. So this is titled Agile Scrum Development, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I want to start by saying a little bit more about Allied Telesis. For those of you who weren't at Karen's talk on Eve, basically we make the gear that connects the internet together. And it's a multinational company. The New Zealand Development Centre, which we're part of, has been using Scrum seriously, thoroughly, for about 2 years. Before that, we mucked around with a few bits of Scrum here and there. We had a few people who were keen on it and a few people who weren't. And so we kind of piloted a few bits and pieces, but we've been using it properly for about 2 years. What we aren't, or anyway, certainly what I'm not, is experts. So I'm managing a group of writers, and we've had to deal with Scrum. It got landed on us by the engineering teams, and we've had to work out where writers fit in and come up with strategies for dealing with the challenges and making as much use of the good as we possibly can. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. Your description in the timetable said that this would be a discussion, and actually it's not particularly. And that's because when I started planning this, I was hoping that there would be another person who was an expert on Scrum who would talk specifically about what Scrum is. But that didn't happen. So I'm combining that level of a very brief introduction with Scrum, into Scrum, with discussion about what we've found, and following that with a bit of discussion time, but not a huge amount. If you come up while you're listening to me with questions that are challenges about Scrum that you would like to talk about, can you please jot them down on a piece of paper? And when we get to that point, I'll ask people to read out stuff that they've found. First, whirlwind intro. This presentation is extremely cut down from a 90-minute presentation by Mountain Goat Software. Their full introduction's available from that website. I've got copies of my handout here for anyone who wants to take one afterwards. That's got the URLs in it as well, and it's on the memory stick. Characteristics of Scrum. Basically, Scrum's a method of running projects. It's a method particularly suited to software projects, first used in 1993 by Jeff Sutherland, and it's got a bunch of features, but the key ones for a brief intro are that projects are done by self-organising teams rather than teams that are led and instructed by a line manager. The teams capture the project requirements in the form of a list, a prioritised list of items. And they do the work in a series of what's called sprints. Each sprint lasts between 2 weeks and a month or so. And during that sprint, they take the items that are the top priority of the requirements that they think they can completely finish within that 2 to 4 weeks, and they do them, and they finish them. So they do the detailed planning, the detailed design, the detailed requirements gathering, the coding, the testing, the documentation, the lot, all within that period of 2 to 4 weeks. And at the end of it, they show the actual working product for that little piece of the project to the people who are the stakeholders, which may be internal or, in extreme cases of it, are actually end customers. So a company that's using Scrum to its extreme will be delivering code to their customers every few weeks, working completed code. It's one of the Agile methodologies. Agile's a collection of methodologies, and Scrum's the most popular of them. They're methodologies that basically let you develop more agilely, be more flexible, respond better to change, and so on. Other names that people are using, other methodologies, include Kanban and extreme programming, and there's others. Agile was put together came together as a collection of ideas in what's called the Agile Manifesto, maybe a decade and a half ago. And it's the individuals and interactions are what they value over processes and tools. And they value working software over comprehensive documentation. This one has caused great grief for technical writers ever since they came up with this description, because they don't say what they mean by documentation. What they actually mean by documentation is internal documentation. So specs, Gantt charts, that kind of thing is not something that Scrum values. They value customer collaboration over contract negotiation. And they value responding to change over following a plan. What it looks like in practice is the standard old popular style of development, which is sequential, is called waterfall. And in that, you will plan the detailed requirements for your project. Then you'll have a period where you'll design it in detail. Then there'll be a period where it'll be coded. And then there'll be a period where it'll be thrown over a wall to a test team and tested. And then at the end of this, and this might be after several years in a traditional project, it will be given out to the customer, who will look at it and say, yeah, okay, that's what I wanted a couple of years ago, but it's not really what I'm after now. And instead of that, Agile does a little bit of each of these things all at the same time. This is what it looks like put together. So you have the list of requirements, which is called the product backlog. Part of the reason why I'm going through this whirlwind intro is to introduce you to the terminology, which is quite different from traditional project management terminology. So the list of requirements is called the product backlog. I have no idea why. Each fortnight or 4-weekly sprint, whatever sprint length you're using, the top items from the product backlog are taken off to form that sprint backlog, which is the items that will be delivered during that sprint. Then there's a fortnight to 4 weeks of development, and at the end of that they have a potentially shippable product increment. And during that sprint, there's a daily Scrum Standup meeting. And in that meeting, people just give a little bit of feedback to each other about how things are going. So that's the outline of what Scrum looks like. I'm going to go into each of those things in a little bit more detail. So this is the things that make up Scrum. There's a bunch of artifacts, there's a bunch of ceremonies, and there's a bunch of roles. Starting with the artifacts, which are really the work description. There's the product backlog, which is that first item in that diagram, and it's just the project requirements. It's a list of everything that's done on the project, that wants to be done on the project. It's prioritised by someone called the product owner. I'll get to that later. It's reprioritised every single sprint, so you're constantly updating the list of project requirements as they change with the customer. Detailed documentation plans don't sit very well with Scrum. I strongly recommend that writers who are working in a Scrum environment forget about things like detailed documentation plans and instead work with the Scrum paradigm, which is to put stories on the backlog. What's a story? A story is an item on the backlog which is worded in the form of, as a person, somebody who's going to be using this product in some kind of way, I want to do something. And often it's followed by because, so as to achieve something else. So for a hypothetical hotel website, which this one is, as a guest I want to make a booking. As the hotel owner, I want to learn how to fix broken bookings. These items, as well as being created as a list, they're also estimated by the team, which is a measure of complexity. So in that case, whoever came up with this has figured that fixing bookings is more complicated than making them in the first place. for example. Then every fortnight, or every 4 weeks, up to 4 weeks, the items get pulled off the product backlog and put onto the sprint backlog. These are the stories that the team is committing to each other that they can deliver that sprint. And I want to emphasise that this is a commitment to other people in the team. It's not a commitment to a manager. Scrum doesn't believe very much in managers. That photo there is some randomly swiped off the internet team's Scrum board, where they have a list of the stories that they're going to commit to this time round, which are written in the form of post-it notes, basically. And beside each of those, they have a list of tasks. So here we have a to-do column, which is the tasks that have not yet been started for each of those stories. An in-progress column that says how the ones that people are currently working on. In their case, a testing column. We don't tend to separate that out. As far as we're concerned, if something isn't tested, it's still in progress. And a done column, and the date that their sprint was going to end. On each of those coloured post-it notes, there would also, at the bottom of it, be a number written for the number of hours that somebody guessed that was going to take at the beginning, and the number of hours done on that project, on that task so far, and the number of hours remaining. So that allows people to update their estimates as they're going as well. People choose their own work. It's not like there's a manager there who says, okay, we've got these 10 tasks to do for this particular story, you'll do that one, you'll do that one, you'll do that one. Instead, you look at the tasks, see which ones you can do, and pick those up. So that's roughly the way that Scrum manages the requirements. The ceremonies, which I've brushed over a little bit, but let's get to them. These things are called ceremonies, not meetings. And if you talk to a Scrum fanatic and you try and call them meetings, they get a little upset about you because they're more than meetings. Honest, they are. But the first one is sprint planning. This can take up to a day, depending on the complexity of your tasks and the amount of the length of your sprints. So basically, the team selects items from the product backlog that they are committing to doing. They identify the tasks of those, they estimate the time, and they put those on the sprint backlog, back on that whiteboard, or on a wall. We tend to use a wall. And the key thing from a docs point of view is to include your docs planning in this. This is the place where the team as a whole estimates the whole of the project, including the documentation. And as part of that, you want to make people aware of your requirements as a writer. So that's sprint planning. Then the daily stand-up, everybody answers 3 questions as a team, as individuals in a team. What you did yesterday, what you're going to do today, and what's in your road. And it's a short meeting that's an excellent way for writers to find out what's changing about a project. Then at the end, there's the sprint review, which is also called the demo. And in that's an hour or 2 or so, where the team demonstrates to anybody who's interested in seeing it what they've actually produced. It's the easiest way to find out what's been delivered, and we've been finding it effective at times to video those so that we've got a record of what's been delivered and how it works. And finally, there's a sprint retrospective. This can be a bit of a challenge. This is where after every sprint, the whole team gets together and talks about what's working and what's not working. It's a structured discussion. It's a place where people raise impediments, work out how to deal with them, suggest improvements, and it's a very important part of the Scrum process because it's how teams get better, get faster and more productive. But if people are having trouble with how writers are integrated into the team or anything else like that, this is where you'll hear about it, in a meeting in front of your peers. Finally, the roles, the people that make up Scrum. First off, there's the product owner. Product owner is kind of like a product manager type of role. They're a person who knows the customer's requirements well, and their job is basically to define what the project will be, what the product that will be delivered will be, when it will be delivered, how good it needs to be, so they're the person who decides at the end of each sprint to accept whether or not something's been completed. In doing Scrum as it was originally envisaged, this person would actually belong to the customer rather than to the development company. So they would be employed by the customer, a representative of the customer. That doesn't often seem to happen in practice, probably mainly because customers seldom have the resource to put a person into. It's a pretty much full-time role, and they seldom have the resource to put a person into the development company's offices for that kind of time commitment. In our case, it tends to be the customer support engineers, the top-of-end ones, who pick up this role because they've got the best knowledge of customer requirements. Another important role, another one that's specific to Scrum, is the Scrum Master, who's kind of like a project manager, kind of. They coordinate the ceremonies. Their job is basically to make sure that the team is doing Scrum properly and that nothing's getting in the team's road. And then there's the team. The team is made up of between 5 and 9 people typically, sometimes a few more, sometimes, well, preferably not a few less. Less would be a few, too few really. They're cross-functional teams. Members in these teams should be full-time, but there might be exceptions. For example, database designer is the exception that they quoted. Unfortunately, tech writer is very, very likely to be another exception. Teams are self-organising rather than led by a manager, and they're stable. Preferably the team, if anything's going to change, the team's work will change, but the team membership won't change. One role that Scrum does not have, as I've said a couple of times, is a manager position, a typical line manager type position, and that's where the whole team question comes into it. So where do writers fit into this? Originally, Scrum was created by engineers for engineers, and everything that I said in that presentation bit about writers, I put in there. There was no planning or organisation for writers in the original Scrum methodology, so writers have had to work out where we fit in. In an ideal world, basically, writers are like any other team member. Each writer is fully part of a Scrum team, which includes co-locating. Co-locating is another Agile word. It means that you sit as a multidisciplinary team in the same place, instead of, for example, having a test team that sits all together and a development team that sits all together and a writing team that sits all together. Ideally, each tech writer would belong only to a single Scrum team, and when we first picked up on Scrum, every time I went and talked to one of our managers about the problems we were having with Scrum, he would say, "You should have a full-time writer on the team," which would have meant that his team got plenty of writing support and no one else did. So that didn't work. But the ideal Scrum development system is one person, one team. This would mean that the company would have to have a higher writer-to-engineer ratio than in waterfall projects. And I've read some optimistic stuff online saying, we're about to implement Scrum, we'll have to take on some more writers. Followed a while later by, we didn't. Ideally as well, writers act a bit differently. They need to treat the documentation as a team deliverable and be flexible and find themselves not limited to writing. There are other things that writers can potentially do. In reality, many writers have to be on multiple teams, which creates all kinds of questions, including should they co-locate, and if they should, which team should they co-locate with? teams may not automatically consider writers to be important team members. You'll hear things like, oh, we're still really doing the background planning on this project. We don't need a writer yet. Yeah. Writers may not want to actually do anything but documentation. Particularly, they may not want a large chunk of their job to turn into something other than documentation. People tend to be writers because they like to write. And they may feel protective of their work and processes, which is not actually unreasonable, given that for many years we've had to defend our work and defend our quality and defend our processes like crazy. To suddenly find that it's a team effort together with the developers and testers may be a bit different, a bit of a change. So what's good about Scrum for tech writers? This is a list of things that we've come up with. First off, and probably the most important, is that your deliverables are part of the project. So we've found that the problem of getting technical reviews of documentation has just totally vanished. How long does it take you to get a review back when you put a document out, John? Yeah. So we get same day, next day reviews of work back from development. Another important thing is that you can be fully involved in the projects. The whole team plans a project, including every team member, including the writer. And another totally different direction, which can be an advantage or a disadvantage depending on your point of view, is that Scrum encourages lean documentation. The whole concept of Scrum and Agile methodologies in general is that, is that you don't want to do anything you don't have to. Everything that you do should have value for the customer. So this is a quote in that box from the Agile Manifesto, one of 12 basic principles of Agile. The art of maximising the amount of work not done is essential. So you can find, if you're in the habit of producing long documents because you always have, your Scrum team might challenge that. And your Scrum team's likely to be an atmosphere in which you can change. Another aspect that's really good for us anyway, is that you get great info about your end customer needs. Scrum specifically has a role in it, the product owner, whose job is to discover as much as possible about the customer's requirements and how the customer's going to use the product. So that info of how the customer's going to use the product, there's your configuration and your task info just there. And our product owners are very interested in documentation. They're extremely keen to get that written down, documented clearly. So they're a great source of info. And another way it's great for your work is that you can be adaptable. You're not stuck with creating an info plan and then delivering to that. You're not stuck with trying to estimate on the basis of a number of page count and then delivering to that. Every month or 2 weeks or whatever your sprint length is, if your projects change, you can change. If you discover halfway through that your customer doesn't actually need a user guide, they need a video on configuration, you can go to producing video. And Scrum can be great for you as well as the work. It lets you learn new skills and try new roles. It's particularly valuable if you're thinking about transitioning out of tech writing into something a bit broader, like usability design or things along those lines, or even testing, want to have a go at a bit of coding. Scrum may actually give you the opportunity to. And the main thing from this, you're part of a high-functioning team that's fun. The teams tend to actually enjoy their work, and that whole environment really shows. So that's a list of stuff that we've come up with that's good about Scrum. How many people here are actually using it? Show of hands. Okay. Anything else that you're finding good other than that list? Yeah. So the fact that you can see stuff right away. Yeah. What's been done right away. Mm-hmm. I'll hand you the microphone. Oh.
Is that right?
Oh, sorry.
When you put your user stories on and your tasks for each sprint, they don't forget about documentation because you're all doing the sprint planning. So you put your sprint tasks on and it's responsibility for everyone. So it doesn't come at the end. It's just as important as every other task.
Mm-hmm. And actually one example of that, one simple example, a few weeks ago I looked at one of the sections of our software reference and realised that there was some stuff in it that didn't make sense for one of our new products. So I got the engineers together who I hope would know about this and asked them what they should be writing instead. And they realised that they hadn't properly tested that particular function, and in some bits of it they didn't know. Well, normally it would be, oh yeah, it's an obscure, it was the appendix out of the software reference, go to the bottom of the list and you'd spend the next 6 months arguing for somebody to find the info for you. In this case, they went back to their Scrum teams, they got it put on the backlog, it got prioritised along with everything else, and a couple of weeks later I got a phone call saying we're working on this now. And it took no effort from me to get that through into the project development. So that's the stuff that's good. What's challenging, particularly for writers? Answer, quite a lot. So I'm going to go through this list of challenges. Supporting multiple teams, the fact that the product keeps on changing, lack of written source material, last-minute code delivery, team self-management, loss of writing as a discipline, and the variability of the workload. Some of these are things that are particular to tech writers or other people who are part-time on Scrum teams. Others of them are just the ugly side of Scrum. They're the things, the disadvantages of Scrum to go with the advantages. Supporting multiple teams. For us, this is a biggie, and it's not only a biggie for us. This is off the Tech World list a couple of years ago. Subject, Scrum sucks. I really liked it at first. There was me, one tester, 3 teams, and about a dozen developers. I thought it was a great way to be on top of every new or changed feature. Now there are 7 teams, about 30 developers, 6 testers, and still me. And I find it very interesting that the number of testers had been increased, but the number of writers had not. Scrum doesn't make a lot of use of the rugby analogy, but imagine playing 7 games of rugby at once, which is the kind of tangle, really, that she was ending up in. This is quite a long thread, and it's very interesting. In Waterfall, 1 writer per 30 developers would be bad, but not necessarily utterly dreadful, not necessarily unmanageable. In Scrum, it's worse, and it's worse for a couple of reasons. We've found that 2 teams per writer, or 1 Scrum team and 1 major non-Scrum project, that seems to be about manageable. On the web, some people are saying they cope with 3 or 4, others are saying 2, yeah. More than that kind of number means trouble for a couple of reasons. Context switching and time spent on those bastard ceremonies. Context switching. The thing about Scrum is that you have to keep up with your teams, or at least kind of vaguely more or less keep up with your teams. And another thing about Scrum is that different teams are a bit different. And in a mature organisation that's got teams that have been around for a long time, they can be quite noticeably different. So you've got to switch between different teams' cultures, personalities, ways of doing things as well. And you have to do this on a daily basis, or at least on a several times a week basis. The only solutions that we've come up with to this really are to time box parts of your day. For example, to say that in the mornings you work on project A, and in the afternoons you work on project B, and in between you can have lunch and do a mental switch. And another point being that if you become consciously aware of the differences, then that tends to help with changing the differences. But this context switching is quite a big deal for Scrum teams. Those of you who've been using Scrum, any comment on that? No. Okay. Along with that, along with the time question, is the time that's spent on ceremonies, which are those sprint planning, sprint reviews, sprint retrospective, and daily Scrum meeting. Sprint planning particularly takes up a lot of time. And if you're on 2 teams and you're doing 2-week sprints, which we are, that's 20% of your time. That's a day of your week in meetings, more or less, over the ceremonies. And the problem with this is that these aren't ceremonies that result in nice, detailed, written plans where you can skip the meeting and then go along and read the information afterwards. If you're not there, you miss out. Particularly if you're not at the daily stand-ups, you miss out. Now imagine you're supporting 7 groups and you've got 7 daily stand-ups to go to. The main advice on the Tech World website to that woman, Kat, was get more writers. Other things that you can do about the time spent on ceremonies, well, you can propose longer sprints. 2 weeks is the minimum that companies use. The proportion of time spent on ceremonies is quite a lot shorter if you're on a 4-week sprint instead. So if you're really struggling, that's probably a good place to start. Your company may not pick up on it, but it's a good place. It's a good thing to try. If you have to, you can cut out going to some parts of some of the ceremonies. I really don't recommend skipping the daily stand-ups unless you're supporting 7 teams, when you've got to. I also don't recommend skipping sprint reviews, but you can skip part of the sprint planning and part of the retrospectives. And you can do this just by asking the team to deal with documentation relating stuff first. And then after that, you leave. It's not great, it's non-ideal, but you can do it. Another important point is to make sure you don't double up your planning efforts. One of the worst things you can do for a time management point of view is sit in a meeting and watch everybody else doing their planning during the sprint planning, and then just kind of mention that, yeah, the documentation task is that you have to write something, and then go away afterwards and come up with a detailed design plan for the documentation separately. It's bad because it takes extra time, and it's also bad because it takes it outside Scrum. More ideas. The other main thing is to communicate efficiently. Talk to people. If possible, co-locate with one of your Scrum teams. Another possibility, if you've got multiple teams, is to get a laptop and have space set aside where each team's working, and then you can kind of move between them as you're working in the other ones. Failing that, get up and walk over and talk to people rather than sitting down and writing emails. The phone works as well, but if possible, get up and talk to people. So that's multiple teams. Another thing that's just one of the ugly sides of Scrum, the disadvantage of the flexibility, is that the product keeps on changing. And this is more of a problem for writers in Scrum than in Waterfall, because you're writing during the development, starting at the beginning of the development stage rather than in the middle or later. It keeps on changing for a bunch of reasons, partly because teams do low priority work last, so they're likely to drop it, partly because they don't do the same level of detailed planning as they would in a traditional project, so they kind of try something. If that's not completely working, they muck with it till it is working. So you get quite a lot of code refactoring in general. And also the features, the big advantage of Scrum, teams will change direction. If this customer needs change, then the team will change. And Agile welcomes that level of change. It's built into the process. What can you do about it? How can you cope with it? One thing that's important is not getting ahead of your Scrum team. So it's important to work from the team's knowledge, work from what the team is actually creating this particular sprint, and this is a particular trap that's easy to fall into if you're working like we are from internet standards, for example. In the past, I've done documentation by downloading the standards documents, reading through them, coming to grips with how our competitors have implemented that protocol, what the standard says about that protocol, how people are describing how they use it online, and written the documentation, quite a lot of it, from that. It's a bad idea in Scrum because you don't know how much of it your team's going to actually implement, and you don't know until they have. Plan late. By that I mean leave your planning as late in the process as you can. Scrum has a concept where on the backlog, the stuff that's in the future will be vague. and the stuff that's coming up to be done will be planned in detail. So, for example, if you're that hypothetical hotel site, you might have an item low down on the backlog that says, I want to do bookings. As a user, I want to be able to organise my bookings online. By the time that's got high enough on the backlog to be actually something that you're doing, the product owner will have gone through and worked out the sub-steps that are required in that. Like, I want to be able to create a booking, I want to be able to delete that booking, I want to be able to fix that booking, and if I can't, then I want to be able to phone somebody and have that person get access to it and they fix that booking, all that kind of thing. So you can leave your documentation planning as late as possible as well. You can come up with outlines that are very broad and fill in the details later. Another thing that we're finding helpful is that in our company, the company as a whole produces software features that get pulled together into a whole pile of a single big release. And we call it during an integration and test period that lasts several months. So that's a period during which we can integrate each team's documentation and polish it. The final solution that people tend to use to changing requirements, and this is popular online, but we haven't had to try it yet, and I'm hoping we won't have to, is to run a sprint behind the developers. So in that case, the developers will develop feature A, like maybe they'll develop the booking system during one sprint, and in the next sprint, you document that booking system. And that works. It's easy for the writers, unless, of course, you're delivering actually to a customer at the end of each sprint. If you're delivering to a customer at the end of each sprint, you can't do that. And I think that says it all. Don't run. If you have to run behind, well, it's a common thing that people, and some companies seem to be making it work, but I don't recommend it unless you have to. Next challenge, lack of written source material. This is tied in with that Scrum believes in people talking to each other. They don't produce formal specifications and design documents, or anyway, they don't produce them at the beginning of the project. Our lot produce them towards the end of it, so they'll document what they have done, but they won't document what they're planning on doing. And this is a feature of Scrum. It's tied in with that Scrum is about talking to people, so basically you need to adapt to it. So my main idea is to embrace the paradigm, get info by talking to people, especially by talking to the product owner. You can make this easier for yourself by getting technical product training, or at least getting an engineer who's willing to fill you in on what the product does as much as possible. It may be possible to extract command details or documentation info from the code. We do that, so it's worth seeing if your developers can do something as well, depending on what your product's like. We've got team wikis, and they are very effective. The developers won't do formal documentation because that's outside of Scrum, but they will jot down stuff in a wiki, and then that's a really good source. And recording the ceremonies is another way that you can capture information even though it's at the end. So those are ideas for dealing with that. Does anyone else have any comments on the stuff so far? No. Okay. Tied in with the whole sprint delivery cycle is the fact that it's short deadlines. Scrum does, you're agreeing wholeheartedly with this over there, really short deadlines. And Scrum doesn't have any long period of testing and bug fixing at all at the end of each sprint. It has engineers who have said to their entire team that they're going to deliver feature X by such and such a day, and boy do they want to. So you can get them delivering code just before the product demo, which is sheer hell if you've got to document that feature just before the product demo as well. Best thing to do with that is to try hard to get the team to deliver the stuff that affects the user interface early in the sprint instead of at the last minute. As long as they've delivered the user interface At the end of week 1, you don't give a hoot if on the last day they're still coding the underlying bug handling type details. It doesn't affect you. Failing that, well, this is another problem that's fixed by running a sprint behind the developers or even just running a few days behind, as long as your product isn't being delivered to customers. Basically, if you have to deliver the product, you as a team have to deliver the product to customers at the end of a sprint, then your team just has to stop doing docs affecting changes early enough. And if they won't do that, then it's a major impediment for you. And you need to raise that with the team, hassle them until they do something about it, and not let them make your life impossible. Which brings me to another item, which is the team self-management. This can be a particular challenge for writers because there's a bunch of software developers, there's a tester, and the tester is much more likely to be full-time on a team than the writer is, and then there's one writer. So there's a whole bunch of engineers, all thinking engineer, and there's one writer. And advocating, standing up for yourself in a Scrum team can be a challenge. If other team members are unhappy with you, you hear about it in a meeting. The good side is if you're unhappy with them, you can tell them in a meeting. This can be fairly unpleasant. And Scrum calls for a lot of commitment from individual people. This is a classic Scrum analogy, the chicken and the pig analogy, ham and eggs. The pig is committed to the process, but the hen is only involved. And Scrum calls for people to be pigs. Things for managing. For a start, don't panic. Teams tend to start off with a period where they're thoroughly argumentative and get pretty snappy with each other. And this actually has a name within the Scrum process. It's called storming. It's normal. Teams expect to do it, and they get through it. But you do have to advocate for your needs. You should be raising impediments as soon as they're a significant problem that you can't solve alone. But, and it's a big but, you can't expect the team to become less efficient overall to solve your problems as one member of the team, because they just won't. Another thing that can help here is to remember that you don't have to import work methods just because that's how you've always done them. You do have the flexibility within Scrum to change. You can get help from other people, particularly the Scrum Master. It's actually their job to help people make the team run smoothly. If there's other writers in your company, then they're a good source of help. There's quite a lot of stuff online. There's some forums. I'll put up some addresses later. Your company's Scrum Evangelist. And this is the person in your company who decided that Scrum was a really great idea and the company should implement Scrum. Hands up those of you who are using Scrum. Hands up those who reckon you've got a Scrum Evangelist. Yeah. Scrum's not something that companies stumble into. It's something that somebody has to push for, particularly because it's quite a challenge to traditional management structures. So somebody has to have experience with it somewhere else, advocate for it in their company, and drive through some kind of pilot scheme. So that person will be highly invested in having Scrum work well in the company. They're a good source of help. Failing all that, you can try your tech comms manager, but coming to the manager takes the whole problem outside of the team, and it's not the ideal way to do it. And a final point on this, it's a good idea for teams to get teamwork training. How many people's teams have done teamwork training as part of starting up in Scrum? Not a lot, okay. If your Scrum teams are having trouble working together, that's something that's quite valuable, because if nothing else, it gets people together in a controlled environment talking about how teams work and how they work as a team. Another problem that's to do with this whole you're part of a Scrum team is the loss of writing, the potential loss of writing as a discipline. It can be quite hard to maintain tech comms teams and standards within your company, particularly because the writers often aren't sitting together any longer. Also, the team self-management means that if you're the tech comms writer like me, you don't really get to tell people what to do anymore. The sprint length deadlines mean that people are very focused on getting their immediate deliverables out. And the fact that there are lean deliverables that you have to only produce, or you're under the paradigm, you only produce what's actually necessary. For our software references, we produce a chunk of decently solid conceptual material that explains how a protocol works, and then we produce a series of configuration examples and step-by-step procedures that show how to use it, and then we do a detailed command reference. And when our Scrum teams create a new protocol, particularly for a new product, they're likely to be working for a particular individual big customer. They're likely to have that customer's requirements in mind at first. It's theoretically possible, we haven't ended up in this position yet, but it's theoretically possible that a Scrum team could decide that that particular customer didn't need the detailed explanation of what the feature did, because somebody at their local training thing was going to train them on that specifically from the local support organisation, so we didn't need to provide that. And I would probably grumble if somebody decided not to produce that material just because their Scrum team didn't need it, because the moment it's integrated back into the product as a whole, it's going to be needed. Ideas for dealing with that? I'll start with the bottom one, which is giving one person overall responsibility for the technical documentation for the company. And I really think companies should keep this. They should keep a tech comms manager role or an information architect type role. And that person would be in charge of consistency, quality, and integration. Other things that you can do and should do is to keep your writers together in informal and formal ways. Make sure that you talk to each other still, hold informal get-togethers, go out for coffee. You can do a Scrum of Scrum type system. Next year we're quite likely going, at the moment we're doing a mix of Scrum and non-Scrum projects. Next year we're quite likely going totally Scrum. And at that point we'll have 3 writers, each with 2 Scrum teams, possibly, hopefully, co-locating with the Scrum teams, and very likely we'll pull each of the writers together into a separate Scrum team made up of the writers, where they'll bring their user stories to the separate writer Scrum team. We'll have a separate board that declares what everyone's doing. We'll fit the integration and other non-Scrum tasks into non-project tasks into that structure, and basically do Scrum above the project Scrum as well, I hope. So that's a formal approach to it. It's really important to keep up peer review, and it's also really difficult to keep up peer review when everybody is working in short deliverable bursts, and to get somebody to peer review your work, you have to fit them into that time deadline. Another thing that's interesting that I'd like to pick up on for us as writers in our company is something that our test team is doing. They have the integration period where at the end of each set of projects where they pull it all together into a release. And during that, they're pulling themselves together and co-locating themselves again as a test team. So during projects, they're being part of the Scrum teams and co-locating with them. During integration, they're pulling the test discipline together again. And if you can do that, that's quite good. To do that, you have to have quite a lot of office space, or at least floor space, because you've got to have seating space to create a separate team again. And the final challenge, which doesn't occur to anything like the same extent in waterfall, is the variability of the workload. Some sprints may have practically nothing documentation-wise, particularly if, in our case, where we're creating hardware products and putting software onto them. The first thing is to get some fundamental underlying stuff working, and that's user invisible, so you don't document it. So during whole sprints at the beginning of a project, there may be spaces where where the writers just don't have anything much to do. In a waterfall system, you'd write ahead. In Scrum, that's a bad idea, but you can't really put your head down and go to sleep on your laptop either, because then you're going to end up in trouble afterwards, and your team and your manager's probably going to complain. Stuff you can do. First point I want to make is don't produce documentation just because suddenly you've got time. This is not a great chance to write the 100-page manual that you really, really like to write because you always have. This is the one point where working on multiple Scrum teams actually helps. So the simplest thing to do is to hope that your other Scrum teams aren't completely relaxed and have nothing for you to do, and work on that. It's also a chance to work on non-sprint tasks. Good point to do integration. Good point to go back and refactor parts of your documentation, update things. Good point to do career development if you're needing training on anything. Possibly a good point to pick up on training on the product. And the other thing that you can do at this point in Scrum is non-writing tasks. So there's a list of things that writers fit fairly well into, depending on what your skill set and interests are. The things that you may be able to pick up for your Scrum team. Don't be afraid to suggest this. Then you've got the other extreme, the stuff that's got too much documentation work in a Scrum, in a sprint. And in spite of what Dilbert's pointy-head boss might think, Scrum is not a way to do more with fewer people. Do more efficiently, ideally, yes, but not to avoid employing people. If you have a short-term problem rather than a long-term problem, like a concentration of writing work in one particular sprint, this is what this is about. It's not about the I've got 7 teams to support and there's only one of me problem. The solution to that is to employ more of you or leave the company. But the solutions, there are solutions to a short-term blip in your workload, and the solution is not really to split the workload over a longer period, though I'll talk a little more about that. The main thing is to be honest with your team. Every sprint, your team will be asking you how many hours you can commit to the sprint and what you can get done in those hours. Don't overpromise. It's very easy to overpromise, to figure that you'll just do the stuff because it needs to be done. Don't. Obviously, you'd want to drop out of any other sprint tasks, cut back on commitment to other Scrum teams if you can. But the other Scrum-specific thing that's really important is that you don't have to pick up all the docs tasks yourself. Docs deliverables are a team thing. I'm not sure how well this would have worked in your things like you're describing, but docs deliverables are a team thing, and it's perfectly okay to make it a team problem and let the team do part of the work. Again, this is solved if you can run behind, which, again, for all the previous set of reasons, I don't like the idea of. It's one reason why it's not a good solution is because it's not a good solution for the team as well as being not a good solution for the documentation. Because the team is, as far as they're concerned, they're finished. They've coded this stuff and it's done. And then in the next couple of weeks, you want them to stop thinking about what they're coding now and go back and get their mind back to the feature from the sprint before and think about that and explain that to you and review that. They're not keen. And it's not as efficient. So really, the ideal solution is to make the documentation deliverables a team problem. And if you don't have the time to do all of them, then other people in the team need to take on part of the load. So that's the list of challenges that we've come up with and the solutions, ideas we've gleaned to them. Any others?
No. We've got one project that's huge and has 6 Scrum teams for the one project. One of those Scrum teams is training and documentation. And each member of the training and documentation team have got a task that they have to go to the stand-ups, just one of each of the other teams, so there's one representative. So they replicate the training and documentation tasks for that team and take them back to their own Scrum board, and they can share them amongst themselves so they don't run out of work.
Yep.
And it's been working really well.
Okay, so that's another good option then. Yeah. Anyone else? Yep.
You mentioned the importance of attending stand-ups, and I just wondered, given the fact that with a stand-up you're not going to see any interface material, you're just listening to what I've done yesterday, what I'm going to do today, do you really see the, what is the actual value? I mean, I guess it is of some value, but...
For a start, it's of value to the team as a whole, because as a team member you also say what you're doing and what you have done, what you are doing, and what's getting in your road. So that what's getting in your road is particularly valuable. It's a good thing to point out. Yesterday I was going to document widget X, but it turned out that widget X hadn't been delivered. Do you realise, person who's delivering widget X, that I can't do my stuff till you do yours? That kind of thing. So that's a benefit. If somebody's talking about doing something different from what you were first expecting, then you'll pick that up. But I think the main benefit really is that being part of the team and letting the team know. Any other comments on that from anyone else?
I was involved in Scrums in another company, and they were not used to having documentation staff anywhere near their developers and didn't like the idea at all. So I made it a point of actually being there, even if I didn't need to be there, to just reassert that I was part of the team and they were not going to get rid of me. I'm going to be there all the time. And it was only 15 minutes. And I actually got to know them socially and also raise my profile.
I think it's a good idea to at least make sure that there isn't anything documentation affecting if you don't attend. I'll talk a little bit more about integrating writers in the next slide. So if I can put that one on hold for half a sec. Okay, we're running short of time, so I'd better move on to, integrating writers. Very roughly, there are 3 models that we've been trying. The integrate fully, or at least as fully as you possibly can, versus the don't integrate at all. And then there's the somewhere in between. And what you're talking about having a Scrum of Scrums, that's probably one model for that somewhere in between type of introduction into teams. And it sounds like it's a good idea. Keep that in mind. On the don't integrate at all question, we had one project last year where we were putting existing software onto a new product, and that new product was basically going to behave the same as all the others. So the documentation was pretty much written. So in that case, a writer kept a watching brief on the project, and the product owner let them know when there were any documentation changes. That worked fairly well. A couple of quick things. I've got a list of websites there that are helpful, a couple of forums at the top, and some useful articles, including, notice, one from Anne from a few years ago. These are all on the thing. And I just want to very quickly finish by saying that we found Scrum to be worth it. And most people online are finding that Scrum is worth it. There's some research out there that suggests that overall companies have 3 times a higher success rate with Scrum projects than with traditional waterfall, which is fairly major for companies. But for writers, it's still, as long as it's running well, it does seem to be a good thing. So I'd encourage people to embrace the paradigm. It works best if you join it instead of fighting it, and that's a bunch of techniques that hopefully will help people with joining it. Thank you.